קבעו פגישות בארבע, אז שידחו את זה עכשיו, מה?
היא מאוד כבר יודעת שזה יגלוש, זה 40 דקות בערך.
יוסי, יושב.
Come on, children.
I'm with you.
Five, four, three, two, one. Shake it back a chair. It's up to you, Stanley.
My guest today is Teddy Kollek, longtime mayor of Jerusalem, and today we're here in his office in Jerusalem. Mayor Kollek, I know it's difficult to speak of Jerusalem in non-historic terms, yet in some senses it's like any other city in that somebody has to take the garbage out. And I think that the world at large doesn't really understand how Jerusalem functions on a day-to-day basis in terms of city council, whether you have a city manager, in relation to a city in the United States.
Well, it's like another city, any other city, but it's also different. We have a city council of 31, which is elected every 4 years on proportional elections according to parties. We have a major party which is based on the Labour Party, but which has also a number of independents in it, which has a narrow majority of 16 out of the 31. And we have some members that belong to Mr. Begin's party, to the government party at this moment, and about 10 members who belong to various religious parties. And the mayor is elected independently, but is also being elected separately together with all the others as part of the 31 members of the council.
You're elected citywide?
All the elections are citywide, and I'm elected, so to say, twice. Once heading a party list, which was fortunate enough to get a narrow majority without any need for coalition, although we went afterwards into coalitions because we feel that the city needs a great deal of consensus and cannot be ruled just on a narrow majority. And I was also elected separately as a mayor.
As you well know, in the United States, as a practical matter, most mayors meet once or twice a week and make broad policy, which is ordinarily implemented by administrators, a city manager, a county manager. For example, I'm from the city of Miami, and in Miami Beach has mayors, but they also have city managers, and then there's a county manager, which operate the day-to-day affairs of the municipality. How does that work in Jerusalem?
Well, we have a general manager of the city, but I'm at the same time the chief administrative officer who follows all the practical things. If tomorrow the garbage wouldn't be collected in a certain part, I would be blamed and not the city manager. My telephone is in the book. People will phone me, and it happens from time to time that somebody phones and says, you know, I have great problem with my garbage. They phone about other things as well, mainly about more important or more urgent, immediate things, but they phone about such things as well. So I'm the chief administrative officer, and but there's another basic difference, or several basic differences between your cities and ours. You have today in Miami a situation which has slightly changed from the not too distant past, that you have many Hispanic-speaking people, and you have therefore schools, not only in English, but in Spanish as well. Now, I imagine that within a reasonable period, a generation or two, everybody will speak English. That's the ideal, and you will return to pure English schools. We in Jerusalem have no such ideal. We think that the various cultures that have existed here for hundreds of years should continue to exist. It's not only the Jews and the Arabs. It's Armenians who have been here since the 4th century and who preserve their Armenian identity, their church, their language, their culture. They regard themselves part of the Armenian nation. They from here send teachers to all the Armenian communities. I imagine you must have one in Miami. They have people all over the world. They have 600,000 to 700,000 Armenians in the United States. The same is true of Greeks, of Abyssinians. We have 30 different churches. Only the Catholics and the Protestants, which are minorities, are kind of universal churches. All the others are national churches with their tradition and their language and their liturgy, and at the same time their national feelings. An Armenian doesn't want to become a Jew, he doesn't want to become an Arab, he wants to continue the tradition that is now here since almost 1600 years as an Armenian community. And therefore integration is a dirty word here. We want separatism. We do try to be separate and equal. And I think we are to a certain extent succeeding in this. Arab schools have a different curriculum than Hebrew schools. And Armenian schools have a different curriculum again.
And they're permitted to do this, and there's no...
Absolutely. This is our ideology. If you would have walked into the old city when nothing existed around, but only the old city within the walls, you would have found separate Armenian quarters and Greek quarters and Latin quarters and Abyssinian quarters and Coptic quarters and go on and so on, the Abyssinian quarters. And of course a large Muslim quarter, and the largest quarter was the Jewish quarter because the Jews were a majority here, since at least when the first census was taken, maybe long before. First census was taken in 1840. So, and each one was separate and preserved his tradition, not only his religion, but also his nationality. And religion and nationality, certainly with Arabs and Jews, but also with Armenians and Greeks, and so go together.
I've interviewed a broad spectrum of Israeli leaders, and it seems to me that the two items on which there is almost total national consensus is, number one, that Jerusalem will never be divided again, and number two, that there will never be a Palestinian state on the west bank of the Jordan River. Is that accurate in your opinion?
I think that's the vast majority of the people support this.
Well, what do you say to those Arab leaders who say the only possibility of ever having peace with Israel is that Jerusalem be, in effect, divided again as it was prior to the '67 war?
Well, my solution for this is, first of all, let's not try a final solution at this moment. It's very much up in the air. Let's try and live together and assure you that your situation, you Arabs, in another 5 or 10 years in Jerusalem will be not worse but better. And I can prove this. In the years when the Jordanians ruled here, the number of Arabs didn't increase, because all the efforts were put into Amman to build up a great capital, and it has grown from 30,000 people to 1 million people by today. But in Jerusalem, they didn't build an industry. When we united the city, the biggest factory was a cigarette factory, I think with 12 or 15 employees. They didn't build a university here, although this is by nature a university town.
And the Jordanians ruled from 1948 to 1967.
From 1948 to 1967, the number of Arabs in this city didn't increase. The number of inhabitants over there didn't increase. Some of the better educated ones left, particularly the Christians, because they were better educated, and some came in from the countryside, but it was a steady number in spite of the tremendous birth rate that they had. Since '67, since we united the city, the Arabs have increased from 65,000 then, the Arabs and the Arab-speaking Christians, from 65,000 then to about 115 or 120,000 now. So their situation has not worsened. They were allowed to remain Jordanian citizens. They had a choice. They could have become Israeli citizens, but we knew if we would give them the choice, only very few would take the Israeli citizenship, and the others would remain Jordanians, the vast majority. We run the schools in the Arab district on an Arab curriculum in Arabic, which is not different from the Arab curriculum that is being used in Jordan. We eliminated certain things. For instance, if we found in the school books, in the textbooks, very beautiful mathematical examples. If you meet 10 Jews and you kill 6, how many remain? instead of using apples and pears or something of the kind. So this was eliminated. But in content, Arab history, Arab literature, the Quran, nothing was changed from the curriculum that exists in Jordan. They can go to Arab countries freely and come back freely every day. As
So
much
your
as they
your
like.
approach basically seems to be very pragmatic. You feel you're going to be
No. It's more than that. I think we are giving up certain elements of sovereignty. The sovereignty of imposing on our inhabitants the Israel citizenship. The sovereignty on imposing our educational system. The sovereignty of not allowing our citizens contact with the enemy. The Jordanians on the other side are our enemy. They have not yet made peace with us. All these are things that are sovereign and that we have given up. The Temple Mount is the holiest place for the Jews. We have not reclaimed it. The Jordanians sit there because today, after the temple was destroyed 1900 years ago or 13 years ago, and eventually in the 7th century, some mosques went up that are holy to the Jordanians. We haven't touched them. They run their holy places. So we have given up certain items of sovereignty. And I think what we have to divide with the Arabs is substance and not demarcation lines. And I believe eventually, over a period of years, we'll come to this. But meanwhile, we have to give them the confidence that their situation won't be worsened. And I think they have that confidence.
The way to give them the confidence is to give up some of these elements of sovereignty, which you just mentioned.
As we have done.
Now, I had occasion...
There's also another element. This morning I had a man visiting here who is the head of the Order of St. John, Lord Grey. He was governor of Northern Ireland. And we compared Northern Ireland and the situation here. And we found, we vied in where the difference between people say publicly and what they say privately is greater. He maintains that in Ireland, nobody really wants the IRA, but nobody dares to say so. I can assure you that nobody here wants the PLO. They're very proud of the PLO when they're outside and when they are performing well at the United Nations, or when they are appearing, when they are recognized in Sweden, or when the foreign minister of France receives Mr. Arafat, but they don't want them here. They are dead afraid of them. They think they will be liquidated, as the people in Algeria were liquidated when Boumediene walked in, and nobody was left alive, with the exception of Mbella, who showed up 12 years later after having been 12 years in prison, and they are afraid of that situation here.
Well, how do you explain the fact that no Palestinian or no Arab, strictly fear?
Strictly fear, and a schizophrenic attitude. They don't like us. We are an occupation force. And one day a solution will come, they are sure. The solution will come from Allah, from the UN, from the US, from the Russians, from the Arab League, from Cholera, whatever it will be. But if the PLO comes here, that's the end.
You honestly believe that if there were a vote, a secret ballot, between the Israelis in Jerusalem and the PLO, that the Arab population in Jerusalem would vote very, very heavily in favor of the Israelis?
No, I don't think that if you have a formal vote, they would vote. I don't think they would come to the ballot. But if you speak to Arabs privately, they say, we don't like you. You are an occupying force. One day you'll have to disappear. We'll have to get our independence again. But certainly we don't want the PLO here. So stay here until we are sure the PLO won't come here. There's no love of us.
Well, what do the Arabs see in lieu of the PLO? If it's not the Israelis...
But why do they have to see something? There are problems you have to live with and not to solve them. You have lots of problems in the United States. What do you do with all the Cubans in Miami? And what do you do with all the blacks in the United States? Have you a solution? No, you live with the problem. So let us live with the problem and don't interfere so much.
Well, that's what I said. Your solution is basically pragmatic. Solve it on a day-by-day basis and do the best you can, and that in the long range things will eventually
I hope
work
so,
out.
yes.
Now, when you say don't interfere so much, I assume
mean
you're
the-
pointing the finger at the United States.
No, I'm pointing the finger at the media,
The American media?
also the American media. I'll give you an example. When you have from time to time demonstrations, they are not very violent. You know, it was predicted that this would become a Belfast or a Soweto or I don't know what. It hasn't.
Civil war, and it has
Yeah,
not.
it hasn't. Today you have tension in cities from A to Z, from Amsterdam to Zurich, even in staid European cities, in Manchester and in London. And here it's going comparatively quietly. You can walk around peacefully, you don't have to be afraid. You don't know how long this will last, because if it happened in Manchester, in Liverpool, and in London, it might happen here as well. So, but at the moment, we are in a very happy situation.
Why does the media do this? For example,
Now,
Begin
now
goes to the United...
if you have a demonstration, it's media created. The people, whether it's an Arab demonstration, whether it's a demonstration of some small group of young Moroccan Jews who feel that they are disadvantaged, they'll phone up and find out whether people like you are available, and they'll organize the demonstration according to your timetable. This is what happens. And it is not interesting to you to show that we have a wonderful educational program for Arabs. That suddenly, because now the girls go to school as well, the mothers want to learn to read and write, which before that, when only the boys went to school under the Jordanians, they didn't mind so much. Has any television operation ever come to look at the adult education program amongst the Arabs? Or the pre-kindergarten program amongst the Arabs that we conduct? None. But if there would be a demonstration, you would have them out in mass.
All right.
And then, and the television camera creates the demonstration.
In terms of the American media's attitude toward Israel generally, Prime Minister Begin goes in September of '81 to meet with President Reagan. Time magazine, a very prestigious publication in the States, comes up with a very anti-Israeli editorial. Newsweek magazine has Begin on the cover, roadblock to peace. Why is that, in your judgment?
First of all, let me say that I myself am also critical of Begin. I don't think he's a roadblock to peace. Maybe he does some things that I don't like very much, but he and his government have sacrificed more to peace than anybody else. Not only have they given up all of Sinai, or are giving up gradually all of Sinai, they've given up our only oil wells. Show me one other country in this time with the energy problem, with the oil shortage. It's a little less so than it was a year ago, but still everybody depends on oil, that would have given up his only oil well. He didn't get any credit for this.
Sadat got all the credit.
Sadat got all the credit.
Because he came to Jerusalem.
He is also a better public relations man. Mr. Begin speaks tough, maybe tougher than he acts. And he has great sense for the masses here, but no great sense for public opinion in the world. So this is the result. But I think it's most unfair. And I'm an opponent to Mr. Begin.
I know that you're in the Labor Party.
Yeah.
Now, former Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, who I interviewed, also a member of the Labor Party, said that in this most recent election between Shimon Peres representing Labor and Begin representing Likud, he felt that Begin, for whatever reason, for whatever intangibles, actually projected a much better image of leadership and of believability than Shimon Peres. And as he sees it, that was one of the main reasons for the re-election of the Likud coalition.
Okay, Stanley. We have to change the cassette.
All right, that was a fast two. It's all right.
Okay. No.
Well, I would fully agree that Mr. Begin had more of a public appeal, particularly to the masses, because of a variety of things. His line was more nationalistic, and that matters particularly with the great number of people who came out of Arab countries, who for generations felt themselves as second-rate citizens in Arab countries, and therefore if you take a strong line against Arabs, and you take a strong line now finally against people like Schmidt or Weinberger, they appreciate that. But I believe that various other factors have also to be calculated. One was Mr. Rabin's months-long harping against Mr. Peres. Nobody likes a party that's squabbling. Mr. Begin's party recognized Mr. Begin as the leader. Mr. Peres's party never recognized Mr. Peres as a leader, and to a very great extent because of Mr. Rabin's fault.
Peres and Rabin are never mentioned in American media, where it's not also mentioned in the same breath that they are bitter foes and enemies.
Indeed, and nobody wants to vote for a party like this, or you have to be very deeply convinced. Secondly...
And Rabin was pretty candid about that for a politician, because he said he basically felt that Peres had not been terribly loyal to him when he was prime minister and when Peres was minister of defense.
Well, I think Mr. Rabin is wrong. I think Mr. Peres has been a very loyal member. Maybe he hasn't got the same kind of attractive personality that Mr. Begin has for many people, but he's a sound and good statesman. That doesn't mean that he's a great vote getter. But Mr. Rabin did a great deal to make him an even less good vote getter. But in addition to this...
Was it wise for Peres to select Rabin as the Minister of Defense in the last...
I don't know that you have to get the pollsters to decide. I wouldn't have done it. But Mr. Peres thought that he would do everything to get peace to the party. I don't know whether it helped. The other thing is that the great talk about the missiles in Syria, the bombing of Beirut, the reactor in Iraq, in Baghdad, all those being concentrated on the weeks before election must have had a tremendous impact on the voters. And as our voters, as I say, come to a very high percentage out of Arab countries, for natural reasons have no particular liking for the Arabs, under whom they suffered one way or the other as second, third, or fourth-rate citizens over centuries, all this had an effect.
You're regarded as a great politician in America in the sense that Americans think you would do very well in American politics. So in that context, I'd like to ask you a question, since Israel is such a contentious society in terms you've just described, the Labor Party and the conflicts and the competition. How in the world has Prime Minister Begin, particularly when he was out of power for some 28 years in a country like Israel, how has he been able to maintain the ironclad control over his party that he has for some over 30 years now?
Well, his party is a different kind of party
Than Labor.
Than Labor. Labor by nature is a very open party, had always very frank and open discussion, was educated on the, or modeled itself on the free discussions that you can see today, for instance, in the Labor Party in England, or in Labor parties in other countries, and the party of Mr. Begin was always an authoritarian party, and has preserved that image.
I'm going to mention some other things that former Prime Minister Rabin said in his interview with me to see whether or not you agree and whether you feel it's consistent with Labor policy. He feels that, and these are his words, it would be a disaster for Israel, for any future government of Israel, not to go along in terms of the peace process with the Camp David Accords. He feels that any agreement to any kind of Palestinian state west of the Jordan River would be the worst mistake in the history of Israel. And thirdly, he regards the United Nations as having essentially no meaning. They play at democracy, and they should not be taken seriously.
I would agree to all three of them.
You would. Okay. So, I don't know if you're aware of it, but in American television, several months ago, there was a program on Masada, which covered 3 or 4 nights, and it was shown on network television. Peter O'Toole played the Roman general, and in the discussion, finally, with O'Toole and the leader of the Jewish forces, the leader of the Jewish forces said something to O'Toole, which a lot of people afterward have taken to have a lot of subliminal meaning in the United States, because he said to the Roman general, "Haven't you people finally learned the best way to destroy or to defeat the Jews? Leave us alone, and we will destroy ourselves." Now, I ask this in the context of what we hear in the States, particularly with the very divisive 1981 election. You hear about the ethnic rivalries, Sephardic, Ashkenazim, religious, secular, young, old. Is there any possibility of that happening in Israel, that someday the Arabs will finally make peace and that internal dissension within the state of Israel itself could be the ultimate problem?
Well, I'm sure it's a problem, but I think the way you put it, it's vastly exaggerated. The thing is this. For 2,000 years, we have had no experience in state management. And now we suddenly have to do it. And it isn't easy. We have our external problems because the world isn't willing to recognize really the state of Israel. They can't help themselves, but they haven't come to terms with it yet, basically. And we internally haven't come to terms with it fully. And it may take a generation or two until we learn enough statecraft internally and externally to manage a country. We were too optimistic when we believed that one day a decision by the United Nations would come down and there we would have our state, and now everything would run smoothly. So we have learned better since then, but we'll learn.
As several years ago, the byword in American politics was the concept of détente. The word which seems to have replaced it, especially vis-a-vis American-Israeli relationships and the whole Middle East cauldron, is the new word, and I'm sure you know what I'm going to say, autonomy. What exactly does that mean in practical terms? And what are you, as a representative, as mayor of Jerusalem, as a member of the Labor Party, what are you willing to give up, as opposed to Begin, who seems to be saying that the West Bank and Gaza were given by God to the Jewish people and we will never give it back?
Well, first of all, I have shown to you how we go ahead in Jerusalem in giving up things. I think it could be an example for the West Bank. I think on the West Bank, where you have a great number of Arabs in their own cities, in their own districts, you could do this with much greater success than in Jerusalem. Even in Jerusalem, we could go further. We could eventually create an independent borough with an Arab borough president, with a great deal of internal autonomy. If the Begin government, or before that, the Rabin government, to whom I suggested this, would have been wise, they would have tried it in Jerusalem. They were afraid that this might lead to a division of the city again. And that is a very impossible thing. Nobody will agree to divide the city again. This was our capital for 2,000 years.
No Jew will agree.
No Jew will agree. I think most Arabs don't agree. They are thinking about all kinds of other solutions which are all not very practical, and I don't want to go into them. But I have here on my wall a photograph of the wall that divided the city. And underneath, I have a photograph of the wall of Berlin, which still divides the city. I think dividing a city is the most cruel thing, just as cruel as you would take anybody on a doctor's table and cut it into half. No city can be cut into half without the greatest of cruelty, and certainly not Jerusalem. This was a sad city when it was divided. It became a much happier city. We haven't solved all problems. Certainly we haven't solved all the problems of the Arabs. We haven't solved all the problems of the Jews either. But certainly it is a happier city today than when it was divided. and people who were living here until 67 in an atmosphere of war all the year round remember this. But we have in Jerusalem gone a great step towards giving Arabs their own way of life. We don't interfere.
Is it
We
your,
still interfere too much. We could interfere even less. But for this you need some legislation which doesn't depend only on us.
is your opinion pretty much the same with the thinking of the Arabs in the West Bank and Gaza as it is with respect to the Arabs in Jerusalem, that they basically would not want the PLO controlling their areas?
I'm certain of that, but I have too little experience of it. You would have to ask other people. I think I know enough about Jerusalem, but I wouldn't like to talk about the other areas other than on principle, because really my knowledge is very limited.
Is any Arab leader, in your judgment, going to follow Sadat's lead and make
Well,
peace with
it's a
Israel?
very complicated business. You know, for many years we have made mistakes. We went to Arabs and said, now, who would like this, that, and the other? And after, there's an old story in Jewish folklore where people asked in a little village in Poland and Russia, who wants jam? And then people come and say, you want jam? So he says, no, I know who wants jam. No. We have played at this game for 14 years, and Arabs don't believe anymore. You would have to go on for a fairly long, decent time consistently, and I'm not certain that we can do that, so that Arabs would again have confidence that what we offer is a definite offer, and we won't retreat from it. And it is not only an empty inquiry after their desires, but it is a real offer. But if we would have such a policy, together with Sadat, in Gaza, and on our own here on the West Bank, I'm sure eventually people will be forthcoming.
Shimon Peres told me that he thinks that the most likely follower of Sadat would be Saudi Arabia, where I think most Americans probably think it would be Hussein from Jordan.
I wouldn't know.
Just impossible to tell, really.
Well, I can't know.
Yeah,
maybe Shimon has met people and talked to people. I don't know to whom he talked, and I don't know what they mean, what their weight is, but I wouldn't know.
There seems to be so much mythology in terms of the Middle East from the American perspective when we see Israel and Sadat, through the Camp David peace accords, attempting to negotiate the so-called Palestinian question, the so-called autonomy issue, when, as far as we know, the Palestinians and certainly the PLO have repudiated Sadat. The only people they hate more than Sadat are the Israelis. So let's assume, even hypothetically, that Sadat and an Israeli government could come to some kind of agreement with respect to the West Bank and Gaza. What assurance does anyone have that the Palestinians would follow that?
You can't have any assurance, but I think that the Palestinians would like to keep their body and soul together. And if the offers would be generous offers, which enable them to show achievements, I think there is a good chance.
Don't you think it's important that somebody has to be created, whether it's created by the State of Israel, whether it's created by the Palestinians themselves, some kind of representative or leader who is going to be able to speak for those people? Because the only thing that we hear about in the American media is essentially the PLO as the representative of the Palestinians. Hussein comes to America, King Hussein comes, he appears on Meet the Press or Face the Nation, and he's always talking about the legitimate representatives of the Palestinian people being the PLO. How does Israel get around that seeming insoluble dilemma?
First of all, I told you that already, there are problems to be lived with and problems you don't solve. If you want quick solutions, there aren't any. I think this has to be worked up gradually. I think the PLO today is at the low ebb of their political influence. No Arab country wants them. Not Morocco and not Algeria, and Libya has only connections with some extreme groupings of them and not with the vast majority. And the Saudis are only afraid, and the Kuwaitis are afraid that the Palestinians will take over and will turn Kuwait into the first Palestinian Republic. And Hussein certainly doesn't want them. And the Lebanese have suffered more than anybody else. And the Syrians have a very limited interest in a certain segment, but not more than that. And I think neither the United States, nor Europe, nor Sadat, nor us are making good use of this situation where one can deal with the PLO and with its weakness instead of trying to work them up every day by a French foreign minister going and meeting Arafat and by somebody else recognizing them and giving them another little lease of life. They're a very small group. The vast majority of the Arab world doesn't want them. But everybody's playing up to them. It is a mistake.
Out of fear.
Out of fear, out of hope that this may have an effect on oil prices or on the sale of machinery to an Arab country or something else. The Arabs certainly out of fear, and the Europeans out of a narrow understanding of the situation, I think.
How do you explain, if you care to attempt to explain, Kreisky of Austria? Because he is shocking, not only to American Jews, but to American Gentiles. You just constantly hear, how can a Jewish leader of another country say the things that that man says? How can he possibly, under any circumstances, make a comparison between an Israeli government and the formation of the Hitler government in Germany?
Well, I think he got himself bogged down in a situation out of which he can't get out, so he's always exaggerating. But basically, Kreisky suffers partly from megalomania, that he believes that really Austria has still the strengths it had maybe before 1914 and plays a major world role, and he can play a major world role in this business. Partly it is, and that goes deeper, it is the background of a particular social democracy, which I know well because I grew up in the same atmosphere in Vienna about the same time, which after the breakup of the Austro-Hungarian monarchy and the breakup because of nationalities, the Czechs and the Hungarians and the Poles and the Slovaks and the Serbs and the Croats and so on, hated all kinds of nationality. The others were gone. The only nationality that was left in Vienna were the Jews. So all the social democratic leaders, many of them were Jews, started out by hating Jewish nationalism, and that was Zionism. He grew up on that when he was 12 or 13 or 14, and he never got rid of it.
Who's going to lead your party in the next election, Labor? I mean, Perez seems to be the most likely. We hear that President Navon may be a possibility.
I don't think that President Navon is a possibility. President Navon will continue his presidency until the end. This is at least another 2 years. He hasn't made up his mind, I'm sure. He has no great desire for this. Whoever mentions him does him a disservice and does the party a disservice.
The Jerusalem Post today, and it mentioned that you were a backer of President Navon for leadership.
I haven't read it. It certainly isn't true.
So the media here is just as inaccurate as the media in this.
I'll look it up and I'll have a correction in tomorrow.
What is the relationship vis-a-vis the office of the president in Israel vis-a-vis Prime Minister of Israel?
Well, the office of the president in Israel is a very formal thing. It is not, it has no real influence, with the exception of the few days after an election when he has to call in party representatives and ask somebody to form a government.
Something like the monarchy in
people are happy and satisfied. Important thing. So if people are happy and satisfied, it's a well-run city, whatever, never mind the potholes in the streets.
When you were talking about a borough of Jerusalem, I was going to say like New York City vis-a-vis Brooklyn.
Sorry to interrupt you when you're ready.
Okay. One question, and then I'll let me know when you're ready.
When you're ready, Stanley.
Something very interesting just happened in the sense that the Jerusalem Post, right in your own city, prints something about you and President Navon, which is not accurate. Yet most people, as you well know, pretty much believe what they read in the newspapers. What's the solution to that problem?
I think journalism in generally is deteriorating. People sit down and write stories without investigating and without really working hard at it.
That could have been checked with a phone call to you.
That could have been checked with a phone call. I have the highest admiration for President Navon. I think he is doing an excellent job under very trying circumstances. He, I imagine, I have discussed it with him, is not particularly in sympathy with the present government, but he behaves extremely correctly. He does everything to bridge psychological differences amongst people and amongst groupings in the country. But I'm sure anybody who talks today about his political future is doing a disservice to him and to the country.
And so a story that comes out basically saying that a group is supporting President Navon to become the next leader of the Labor Party and you're a member of that group is just totally inaccurate.
I know that a group like this exists in spite of President Navon not desiring it. They were never in touch with me, they never asked me.
Mayor
If they
Kollek,
would have, I would have said that it's a foolish thing to do.
thank you very much. You're saying it now. Thank you very much.
Not to the right public.
You never can tell. You never can tell.
Can you just look at Stanley, please? Just for intercuts. You nod your head, Mr. Kollek?
What do you want me to do?
Just nod your head to say, Ken.
Absolutely, I agree to every word you say.
Stanley, look at Mr. Kollek. Okay, Stanley, count from 1 to 10.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10.
Hands up, flat. Yes with your head, Stanley.
What?
Just say yes with your head. Very nice. The nicest yes in the business. Thank you.
Thank you.